The bedroom smelled like her perfume, and the suitcases he had packed in silence. She stood in the doorway with one hand resting on the frame, watching him fold a shirt he had never let her iron. And then she said the line that broke him before he had even left. "I always knew you would leave one day, Caspian. I just thought you would have the decency to do it before I stopped loving you." He froze. The shirt stayed half-folded in his hands. Outside the tall windows of the estate, the rain came down in slow, steady columns over the gravel drive, and somewhere in another room, a clock counted the seconds with the patience of a thing that had nothing to lose. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks. He had not rehearsed her. And even the most feared man in 3 cities did not know what to do with a woman who refused to bleed. The estate sat at the end of Morenas Lane, a private road that curved through 6 acres of old chestnut trees on the northern edge of St. Aurel. From the wrought iron gate at the bottom of the hill, the house looked like something a wealthy stranger might photograph and forget. From the inside, it looked like a museum where someone had once tried to live. The walls were a pale stone gray. The floors were dark walnut, polished to the kind of shine that showed every footprint. The ceilings were high enough to swallow voices, and the windows were tall enough to let in the kind of cold November light that fell across furniture without warming it. There were paintings in the hallway that had cost more than most houses. There were rugs from places neither of them had ever visited. There were 3 sitting rooms, 2 libraries, a wine cellar, and a kitchen large enough to host a banquet. And yet the only room that had ever felt lived in was the small breakfast nook where she took her coffee in the mornings. The estate had been a wedding gift to itself. Caspian Vorath had bought it the year they married, the way other men buy rings. He had told her then that it was a fortress. What he had not understood was that fortresses keep things in as well as out. For 9 years she had walked these halls in soft slippers and quiet shoes and waited for the rooms to feel like hers. They never did. They had always belonged to him, and to the men who arrived at odd hours, and to the meetings that ended with cars pulling away before sunrise. It was a beautiful house. It was a tired house. And tonight, after 9 years of silence, it was about to become something else entirely. Her name was Inessa Vorath, and at 34 years old she had become very good at being unseen. She had sand-colored hair that fell to the middle of her back, usually pinned up in a loose twist with a single tortoiseshell comb she had owned since university. Her eyes were the color of weak tea, slightly downturned at the corners, the kind of eyes that made strangers think she was sad even when she was not. She was clever, but she had learned to hold her cleverness behind her teeth because he did not like being corrected. She was warm, but she had learned to portion her warmth like rationed sugar, because warmth, freely given, was something he had taught her to be ashamed of. She had married him at 25, in a small ceremony at a chapel near the coast, with only 14 guests and a borrowed bouquet. She had loved him then. She had loved the version of him that opened car doors and remembered her mother's birthday, and brought her tea in the mornings without being asked. That man had lasted about 3 years. The man who came after him had used the same face and the same voice, but he had spoken in a different language, one made of long silences and brief disappointments, and the slow surgical removal of every piece of her that had once made him laugh. She did not know exactly when she had stopped loving him. There had been no single moment, no slap, no betrayal she could name. It had been more like a tide going out. One day she had looked across the dinner table and realized that the man sitting opposite her was a stranger she had been polite to for years. What Caspian had never noticed, because Caspian noticed only what served him, was that Inessa had not spent those years dying. She had spent them preparing. Every morning for the past 4 years she had risen before him, made her own coffee in the small breakfast nook, and written for 1 hour in a leather notebook she kept in a drawer he had never opened. The notebook was not a diary. It was a ledger. Names of his associates, dates of his meetings, numbers she had overheard, addresses she had memorized. She did not know yet what she was building. She only knew that a woman who lived in a fortress should at least keep a key. Every Thursday afternoon, while he believed she was at her standing appointment with a hairstylist named Morwenna, she had instead been driving to a small office above a bookshop in the old quarter of Saint Aurel, where a woman named Thea Brossard had been quietly teaching her, for €200 a session, how to read contracts, how to trace assets, and how to disappear without leaving a trail. And every night, after Caspien had fallen asleep with his back to her, she had reached into the bottom drawer of her vanity and touched the small velvet pouch that held a single object, a house key. Not to this house, to a different one. A small stone cottage on the coast that her grandmother had left her in a will Caspien had never read, because he had assumed, as he assumed everything about her, that it could not possibly matter. She braided her hair every morning the way her grandmother had taught her. 3 even strands, pulled gently, finished with a thin ribbon she kept in the same drawer as the key. She did this not because Caspien asked her to. She did this because it was the one part of her day that belonged to her. And tonight, standing in the doorway of the bedroom while her husband packed a suitcase to leave her for a woman whose name he had whispered in his sleep for the last 3 weeks, Inessa Vorath was not afraid. She was not heartbroken. She was not even surprised. She had been waiting 9 years for this exact night. And he had no idea. Caspien did not love her. He had not loved her in years. But he had needed her in the specific way that powerful men need wives, the way a flag needs a pole, and Inessa had served that purpose with a quietness he had mistaken for devotion. The trap had not been built in a single night. It had been laid stone by stone over 9 years, the way a man builds a wall around a garden and then forgets that the garden was the part that mattered. In the first year, he had asked her to leave her position at the publishing house in the city, where she had been a junior editor with a small office and a corkboard full of postcards from authors who liked her. He had said it was beneath her. He had said his wife should not work. He had said this with a soft hand on the back of her neck, and she had agreed, because she had still believed then that love was a thing you compromised for. In the second year, he had begun to dislike her friends. There was Leora, who laughed too loudly at dinner parties. There was Saskia, who once asked Caspien a question about his business that he could not answer in front of company. There was Pernille, who had known Inessa since school, and who had once, during a long drive home, gently asked Inessa whether she was happy. One by one, Caspien had found reasons. A misunderstanding here, a perceived slight there. By the 4th year, the phone calls had stopped. The dinner invitations had stopped. The women who had once filled her life had drifted to the edges of it like leaves in a slow current, and Inessa had stood in the middle of an emptying room and told herself this was what marriage looked like. In the 5th year, her mother had died, and Caspien had been away on what he called business. He had returned on the morning of the funeral with a black tie and an apology that smelled of someone else's perfume, and Inessa had said nothing, because by then she had already learned that saying things did not change them. In the 6th year, she had stopped asking where he went at night. In the 7th year, she had stopped expecting answers when she did. In the 8th year, she had begun the notebook. And tonight, in the 9th year, on a Tuesday in November, with rain falling over the chestnut trees, Caspien Vorath had finally decided that he wanted to keep a different woman, and he had walked into the bedroom and announced it the way another man might announce a change of weather. "I am leaving," he had said. "There is someone else." He had expected her to cry. He had expected her to beg. He had expected, perhaps, the quiet collapse of a woman who had built her entire life around a man. What he had not expected was for her to smile. "Who is she?" Inessa asked it without looking at him. She had crossed the bedroom and was sitting now on the small velvet bench at the foot of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face composed in the way she had been composing it for years. Caspien did not answer at first. He was still holding the half-folded shirt, and there was something in his posture that had not been there a moment ago. A small shift. The shift of a man who had walked into a conversation expecting one weather and had found another. You do not know her, he said finally. Her name is Anouk Verrier. Anouk Verrier. Inessa repeated the name slowly, the way a person repeats a word in a foreign language to make sure they have understood it. And then she nodded, almost to herself, and said, "The girl from Bellecourt." Caspian stared at her. "How do you know that?" Inessa smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "You used to keep a photograph of her in the inside pocket of your wallet, Caspian. You stopped carrying it 3 years ago, but you replaced it. There is a copy in the drawer of your desk in the study, behind the box of cigars you do not smoke. I have known about her for a very long time." The silence that followed was the loudest silence the bedroom had ever held. Caspian set the shirt down on top of the suitcase. He did not look at her. He looked at the rain on the window. "Why you not said anything?" he said at last. Inessa tilted her head. "Why would I have? You did not stop loving me because of her. You stopped loving me long before her. She was just the door you finally found." He turned to look at her then, and after years of looking through her, he watched her face do something he did not recognize. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to fear. The fear of a man who has lit a match and discovered he is standing in a different room than he thought. "You always knew," he said. "It was not a question." "I always knew," she answered. He sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress sighed under his weight. For a moment he looked smaller than he had looked in years, smaller than the suit he was wearing, smaller than the house he had bought to contain him. And Inessa watched him with the same calm she had watched him with for the last 4 years. The calm of a woman who had stopped expecting anything from a man and had therefore stopped being disappointed by him. "I should have told you," he said. "You should have done many things, Caspian. Telling me would not have been the first one." He flinched. It was a small flinch. She saw it. "I want you to know," he began, "that this is not about you." She laughed. It was a soft laugh, almost gentle, and it surprised him so completely that he stopped speaking and just looked at her. She did not laugh often. She had not laughed in his presence in perhaps 2 years. The sound was like finding a coin in a coat you had not worn since spring. "Of course it is not about me," she said. "Nothing has ever been about me, Caspian. That is the only consistent thing about you." He opened his mouth to reply and closed it again. He had built his life on his ability to find the right word. She had taken every word he had prepared and made it useless without raising her voice. "Where will you go?" he said finally, because he could think of nothing else. She did not answer. He waited. "Inessa, where will you go?" She looked at him then, and for the first time in 9 years, she looked at him the way one looks at a stranger on a train. Polite, unbothered. Already mentally arrived somewhere else. "That is not your concern anymore," she said. "Of course it is. You are my wife." Was. The word fell between them like a small stone into still water. Was. Past tense. A grammar he had not seen coming. "I will have my lawyer reach out to you in the morning," she said. "I assume you will be staying at the apartment in the city tonight, the one on Rue de la Paix, the one Anouk has the second key to." Caspian stared at her. "How do you know about the apartment?" Inessa stood up from the bench. She crossed to the window and looked out at the rain falling on the chestnut trees, and when she spoke again, her voice was not bitter and it was not broken. It was calm. It was the calm of a woman who had stopped performing love a very long time ago, and who had finally been given permission to stop performing the rest. "Caspian," she said, "there is a great deal you do not know about me. There is a great deal you decided not to know. You have spent 9 years living with a woman you never bothered to read, and tonight, of all nights, is not the night you are going to start." She turned to face him. "Pack your suitcase. Take what is yours. Leave the keys to this house on the table by the door." By tomorrow morning, I will not be here anymore, and neither will anything that ever belonged to me. We will not see each other again outside of a courtroom. Do you understand? He did not answer. Do you understand, Caspian? He nodded once. Slowly. Good, she said. Then I would like you to leave the bedroom now. I have things to do, and I would like to do them alone. And without waiting for him to obey, she walked past him, past the suitcase, past the half-folded shirt, past 9 years of a marriage she had outlived in silence, and she closed the bedroom door behind her with the softest click of a latch he had ever heard. It was the sound of a door locking on the inside. Only she was the one walking out. Caspian Vorath stood in the bedroom for a long time after she left. He was 47 years old. He was the second son of a Marseille shipping family that had built its fortune on routes the harbor masters had been paid not to inspect. He had inherited the name at 23, when his older brother had been killed in a dispute over a debt that should never have been collected. He had spent the 24 years since then building an organization that ran from the docks of Saint-Aurel to the warehouses of Lyon and the back rooms of 3 cities he did not bother to name in front of strangers. He had judges who returned his calls before their wives did. He had, in his coat pocket at this very moment, a phone that could ruin 4 lives before breakfast. And he was standing in his own bedroom, holding a shirt, unable to remember why he had come in. He sat down on the edge of the bed where she had been sitting. The velvet bench still held the faint impression of her weight. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at the door. He looked at the rain on the window. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in a hallway he had not walked down in 30 years, a small boy stood in the doorway of a kitchen in a stone house outside Marseille and watched his mother pack a suitcase of her own. Her name had been Beatrice. She had been 26 years old. She had been very beautiful and very tired, and she had loved her husband in the way some women love the weather, accepting its cruelty as a thing that could not be argued with. Caspian had been 7 the year she left. He remembered the suitcase. He remembered the rain. He remembered standing in the doorway and asking her where she was going, and he remembered the answer she had given him, the answer he had not understood for 30 years. I am going somewhere I should have gone before I met your father, mon petit. I am sorry I waited so long. He had not understood it then. He understood it now. His mother had not been weak. His mother had not been broken. His mother had simply been a woman who had finished, quietly and completely, the long internal work of leaving, and had packed the suitcase only after the leaving was already done. Caspian had spent the rest of his childhood believing she had abandoned him. He had spent his 20s believing she had been faithless. He had spent his 30s refusing to think about her at all. And now, at 47, sitting on the edge of a bed his wife had walked away from with the same calm his mother had once walked away with, he understood for the first time that some women do not leave when their hearts break. Some women leave on the morning after, when the breaking is already finished, and there is nothing left in the house except the inventory. He had married Inessa 9 years ago because she had reminded him of his mother. Soft voice, long hair, eyes that watched without judging. He had spent 9 years making sure she did not become her. And tonight, he had pushed her, finally, all the way through. He picked up the shirt. He folded it the rest of the way. He placed it carefully in the suitcase, and his hands were not entirely steady. He remembered then a question his mother had asked him one summer evening in the kitchen outside Marseille when he had been 6 years old. She had been peeling apples, and she had not looked up when she spoke. "Caspian," she had said, "do you know the difference between a house and a home?" He had not known. "A house," she had said, "is what a man builds when he is afraid of being alone. A home is what a woman builds when she has finally stopped being afraid." He had not understood it then. He understood it now. He zipped the suitcase closed. The sound was small and final. And as he stood in the bedroom of the house he had bought to be a fortress, in the silence of a marriage that had ended without raising its voice, Caspian Vorath understood that he had not just lost a wife. He had lost the only person who had ever stayed long enough to know him. Inessa did not go downstairs. She walked instead to the small breakfast nook at the back of the house, the only room she had ever called her own, and she sat at the round oak table where she had taken her coffee every morning for 9 years. She did not turn on the light. She did not need to. The rain on the windows threw a thin silver wash across the walls, and she could see well enough in the half-dark to do what she needed to do. She placed her phone on the table. She placed a small leather notebook beside it. She placed, finally, a single house key on a brass ring, the key her grandmother had left her. The key Caspian had never asked about because he had never imagined she had a door he did not own. Then she opened the notebook to a page she had marked 9 months ago, and she dialed the first number on it. The phone rang twice. A woman answered on the third ring, fully awake despite the hour, the way certain professionals always are. Thea Brossard speaking. It is Inessa. The pause on the other end was small and exact. Then Thea said, "Has it happened?" "It has happened. He told me an hour ago. He is packing." "Are you safe?" "I am safe. I am downstairs. He is upstairs. He does not know I am calling you." "Good. Listen to me carefully, Inessa. I have been preparing for this conversation for 2 years. There are 3 things you are going to do tonight, and 3 things you are going to do in the morning, and if you do them in the order I tell you, by this time tomorrow he will have no legal claim to anything you do not freely give him. Do you understand?" "I understand. First, the notebook. Bring it with you when you leave. Do not photograph it. Do not scan it. Do not back it up. Originals only. We will copy it together at my office." "Yes." "Second, the cottage. Drive there tonight. Do not stop. Do not tell anyone where you are going. There is a woman named Halia Onstad who lives in the village 2 kilometers from your grandmother's house. She is a retired notary. She is expecting you. She will witness your signature on a document I am sending to her tonight. Do you remember her?" "I remember her." Third, your phone. Throw it into the sea before you reach the cottage. There is a new one waiting for you in the lockbox under the stone bench by the front door. The code is your grandmother's birthday. Inessa wrote nothing down. She had memorized everything Thea had ever said to her. It was one of the things Thea had taught her in the office above the bookshop. In the very first lesson. A woman who writes things down can have the things she writes taken from her. A woman who remembers cannot. Thea. Yes. He is not going to make this easy. I know. He has people. He has lawyers. He has men who answer phones at 3 in the morning. I know that too. So do I, Inessa. The difference is that mine are better, and they have been waiting longer. For the first time since the bedroom door had closed, Inessa felt something move in her chest that was not calm. It was not quite hope. Hope was a young feeling, and she was past it. It was something older and quieter. It was the recognition of a hand reaching down into a deep well and finding another hand already there. I will see you tomorrow, Thea. I will see you tomorrow, Inessa. Drive carefully. The road past Vimoutier floods in November. Take the long way through the orchards. The line went dead. Inessa set the phone down. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen, and dropped it into the deep ceramic sink her grandmother had given them as a wedding present. She turned on the tap. She watched the screen flicker once and go dark. Then she went upstairs to pack. She did not go through the bedroom. She went instead to the small dressing room at the end of the hall, the one Caspian had never entered because he had never been curious about what a woman keeps. From the back of the wardrobe she took down a soft brown leather bag her grandmother had carried during the war. From the bottom drawer of the vanity she took the velvet pouch with the cottage key. From a hat box on the highest shelf, she took an envelope of cash she had been adding to for 47 months. From the false bottom of her jewelry box, she took her mother's ring. She did not take the wedding ring. It was sitting on the bedside table where she had placed it an hour ago, before she had ever walked through the door. She walked back down the stairs. She passed the bedroom, where she could hear Caspian moving slowly, a man underwater. She did not stop. She walked through the front hall, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the rain. She did not look back. The rain was cold and steady and clean. She walked across the gravel drive to the small black car she had bought 11 months ago and registered in her grandmother's maiden name. She placed the bag on the passenger seat. She turned the key. The engine started on the first try. And as she rolled down the long curve of Morenis Lane for the last time, with the chestnut trees bending slightly in the wind and the lights of the estate fading in her mirror, Inessa Vorath did something she had not done in 9 years. She rolled down the window. She let the rain hit her face. She breathed. The cottage was 3 hours away. She drove without music, without speaking, without checking the mirror. The road wound through low hills and sleeping villages, past orchards that smelled of wet apples even with the windows up, past the small bridge at Vimoutier, where Thea had warned her about the flood, and where she took the long way through the orchards as instructed. She did not stop for petrol. She had filled the tank 3 days ago at a station Caspian did not know she used. She did not stop for coffee. She had a thermos in the bag, prepared that morning with the calm of a woman who had been preparing for this morning for a very long time. She thought, as she drove, about the version of herself who had driven this same road 11 months ago to register the car. That woman had been afraid. That woman had checked the mirror every 2 minutes. That woman had practiced excuses in case Caspian called and asked where she was, the way a child practices a lie before walking into a kitchen. That woman had not yet fully understood that the leaving had already happened, years before, somewhere quiet inside her, and that all of this was simply the paperwork. Tonight, she did not check the mirror. She did not practice excuses. The phone was at the bottom of the kitchen sink at Morenis Lane, and Caspian did not know the make of the car she was driving, and the woman behind the wheel was no longer a woman who needed to lie about where she was. She arrived at the cottage at 27 minutes past 2 in the morning. It sat at the end of a narrow stone lane that ran down toward the cliffs, half hidden by a hedge of rosemary and salt wind, with a slate roof and a blue door and a single iron lantern hanging beside the threshold. Her grandmother had bought it in the year 1961 with money she had saved from teaching piano lessons in the village, and she had left it to Inessa with a single sentence written on the back of the deed. For the day, you remember you are mine, before you are anyone else's. Inessa had not understood that sentence at 14. She understood it now. She parked. She found the lockbox under the stone bench by the front door. The code was her grandmother's birthday, the 3rd of April, 1932. She entered it. The box opened. Inside was a small cardboard box with a new phone, already charged, already configured, and with a single contact saved as Thea. She stepped inside the cottage. It smelled of cedar and old books, and the faint, clean smell of stone that has been kept dry for decades. The floors were terracotta. The ceilings were low. There was a small kitchen with a copper kettle. There was a sitting room with 2 armchairs and a bookshelf full of her grandmother's novels. There was a bedroom with a white quilt and a window that opened onto the sea. The sea was not visible at this hour, but she could hear it. A slow, steady breathing somewhere below the cliffs, the oldest sound she had ever known. She set the bag down on the sitting room floor. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She did not do any of the things a less prepared woman might have done. She simply walked to the small kitchen, filled the copper kettle from the tap, and set it on the stove. While the water heated, she opened the bag, took out the leather notebook, and placed it on the kitchen table beside the new phone. The kettle began to whistle. She made tea. She drank it slowly, sitting at the table watching the rain fall outside the kitchen window. She thought, for a long moment, about Caspian. Not with hatred, not with longing, with the small, distant tenderness of a woman remembering a dog she had loved as a child, a dog that had bitten her once, and that she had nonetheless missed, briefly, after it was gone. Then she finished the tea. She rinsed the cup. She placed it upside down on the wooden rack beside the sink, and she went to sleep. She slept for 6 hours, dreamlessly, in the bed her grandmother had once slept in, under the white quilt her grandmother had once stitched, in the only room in the world that had never belonged to Caspian Vorath, and never would. She woke at 22 minutes past 9 in the morning. The phone was already ringing. It was Thea. "Are you there?" "I am here. How was the drive?" "The drive was good. I took the orchards, as you said. The bridge was flooded. I am pulling up to the cottage now. There is a woman with me. Her name is Halia Onstad. She is the notary. We are going to spend the next 2 hours making you legally untouchable. Are you ready?" "I am ready." By 11 that morning, Inessa Vorath had signed 17 documents at the small kitchen table beside the copper kettle. Halia Onstad turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s, with white hair pinned in a knot and reading glasses on a silver chain. She had once been the head notary for the entire Western Coast, before she had retired to keep bees. She read each document aloud before Inessa signed it, and she explained each one in the kind of plain, unhurried French that Inessa's grandmother had spoken. There was a deed transferring full ownership of the cottage from a holding company Thea had set up 2 years ago into Inessa's maiden name, Inessa Marcassine, the name she had carried for the first 25 years of her life and had never, in her own heart, stopped using. There was a notarized inventory of every asset Caspian had moved into Inessa's name during the marriage for tax purposes, assets he had assumed she did not understand, and assets that would now require her signature to liquidate, and that her signature, today, would refuse to provide. There was a sworn statement, witnessed and stamped, attesting to the existence of the leather notebook and to the chain of custody under which it had been kept, a statement that would make the notebook admissible in any court in the country. There was a petition for divorce on the grounds of adultery, prepared by Thea 3 weeks ago and dated for tomorrow morning, citing Anouk Verrier by name, address, and date of first contact. There was a separate civil action for restitution of premarital assets, including a small inheritance from Inessa's mother that Caspian had quietly absorbed into his own holdings in the 3rd year of the marriage, an absorption Thea had been documenting for 2 years. And there was, finally, a letter. Not legal, personal. Written by Inessa herself 3 months ago, in the office above the bookshop, under Thea's quiet supervision. A letter to be delivered to Caspian Vorath at the apartment on Rue de la Paix by a courier service that did not require a return signature, at 12 o'clock noon on this exact day. Halia Onstad read this letter aloud last. She read it slowly. When she finished, she folded it once, placed it in a stiff cream envelope, and handed it to Thea. "It is good," Halia said. "It is honest. He will not understand it, but it is good." Inessa nodded. Thea looked at her across the table. "Are you certain?" she said. "I am certain. Once this letter is delivered, there is no negotiation. There is only paperwork. He will try to call. He will try to come here. He will try, eventually, to send people. Are you prepared?" "I am prepared." Thea studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "I have been a lawyer for 31 years, Inessa. I have represented women who were braver than this, and women who were angrier than this. But I have never represented a woman who was readier than this." Inessa allowed herself, for the first time since she had walked out of Morena's lane, a very small smile. "Good," she said. "Then I would like a second cup of tea." Halia Onstad left at 11:30. Thea stayed. She walked with Inessa down the narrow stone path behind the cottage, the one that led to the cliff edge and the long view of the sea, and for a while, neither of them spoke. The wind had cleared. The morning was sharp and bright in the way only coastal mornings are after a long rain. The sea was the color of old slate. Thea lit a cigarette. She had quit 11 years ago. She kept one in her case for moments like this. "You have not asked me," she said, "why I took your case. I did not think it was my place. It is your place. You paid for it. You taught me too much for €200 a session, Thea. I always knew you had a reason." Thea exhaled slowly. The smoke curled out over the cliff and disappeared. "My older sister was named Lisbeth. She married a man in 1993. He was charming. He was wealthy. He was the kind of man who opened car doors and remembered birthdays. By 1998, he had separated her from every person who loved her. By 2001, he had taken her name off every account they shared. By 2004, he had convinced her that she was nothing without him. And on a Tuesday in November of that year, the same month we are in now, he came home and told her he was leaving her for someone else." Inessa did not interrupt. Lisbeth did not survive that winter. Her body simply gave out, the way a body does when it has been carrying too much for too long, the way my mother said hearts can break in places medicine cannot reach. She had a notebook too. Hers was full of poems. Mine has been full of laws ever since. Thea took another long drag. "When you walked into my office 2 years ago, Inessa, I knew within 10 minutes what kind of woman you were. You were the woman my sister could have been if someone had reached her in time. I have been waiting 22 years to reach a woman in time." She looked at Inessa. "I am not looking away." Inessa took the cigarette gently from Thea's hand. She did not smoke it. She held it for a moment, watched the small ember at the tip, and then handed it back. "Thank you," she said. It was the only thing either of them said for a long while, and it was enough. That afternoon, after Thea had driven back to the city, Inessa walked through the cottage room by room and did something very small and very deliberate. She opened every window. The cottage had been closed up for 9 months, since the last time she had visited under the cover of a weekend her grandmother had supposedly requested. The air had been clean, but still. Now she opened the kitchen window, and the bedroom window, and the 2 windows in the sitting room, and the small round window at the top of the stairs that looked east toward the orchards. The sea wind moved through the rooms like a slow hand, lifting the edges of the white quilt, fluttering the pages of her grandmother's books, carrying out of the house the last invisible residue of 9 years she had not lived in it. She stood at the kitchen window with her hands on the sill. She let the wind reach her. And then, without warning, without performance, without any of the dignity she had carried with her for the last 14 hours, she began to cry. She cried with her face in her hands and her shoulders shaking and her breath coming in long, uneven pulls. She cried for the woman she had been at 25, who had walked into a chapel on the coast in a borrowed dress and believed every word a man had said to her. She cried for the woman she had been at 30, who had stopped calling her friends because it was easier than explaining. She cried for her mother, who had died alone on a Tuesday in March, while her son-in-law was in another country with another woman. She cried for the 9 years she had spent rationing her own warmth like a woman rationing bread in winter. She cried until she had nothing left. And then she walked to the front door of the cottage, the small blue door her grandmother had painted herself in the spring of 1964, and she turned the iron key in the lock. The lock was old. It made a soft, clean sound, the sound of a thing that had been waiting a long time to be useful. She left the key in the lock. It was her door now. It would always be her door. There would never again be a man who walked through it without her permission. She went into the bedroom. She lay down on the white quilt. She did not undress. She did not pull the covers up. She simply lay there with the sea wind coming through the open window and the late afternoon light falling across her face, and she fell asleep before the church bells in the village rang 4. She slept that night like a woman who lived alone, and the sleeping was clean. And in a bedroom 3 hours away on Marenes Lane, Caspian Vorath sat on the edge of the bed his wife had walked away from, holding a stiff cream envelope that a courier had handed him at 12 o'clock noon, and he read the letter she had written him 3 months ago. He read it 3 times. After the 3rd time, for the first time in 30 years, he put his face in his hands. The next morning, the world began to move around Inessa in ways Caspian Vorath could not stop. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Thea Brossard walked into the regional courthouse in Saint-Aurel and filed the petition for divorce, the civil action for restitution, and a 3rd document neither Caspian nor Anouk Verrier had been expecting. It was a request for an emergency freeze on 6 commercial accounts, 3 real estate holdings, and 1 shipping license, all of which carried Inessa's signature as co-holder, all of which Caspian had assumed she would never think to exercise. The judge who reviewed the request was a woman named Eveline Marchot. She had known Thea for 19 years. She had known, vaguely, of Caspian Vorath for somewhat longer. She granted the freeze in 40 minutes. By 10 o'clock, the freeze had taken effect. 3 of Caspian's morning meetings collapsed before lunch. A shipment scheduled to leave the port of Saint-Aurel that afternoon did not leave. A man in Lyon who had been expecting a wire transfer at noon did not receive one. A second man, in a back room in a 3rd city, made a phone call that Caspian did not return. By 11, Caspian had called his own lawyer, a man named Bertrand Coulis, who had handled the family's affairs for 20 years. Bertrand listened for 90 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "Caspian, who is her lawyer?" "Thea Brossard." There was a long silence on the line. "Bertrand, are you there?" "I am here." "Caspian, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I cannot represent you in this matter." "What?" "I cannot represent you in this matter. Thea Brossard does not lose. She has never lost. I have watched her end 3 marriages bigger than yours and 1 career larger than mine. If I take this case, I will lose. And I will lose publicly. And I will lose in a way that will damage every other client I have. I am sorry, Caspian. You will need to find someone else." Bertrand hung up. By noon, 2 more lawyers had said the same thing. By 1 o'clock, Caspian Vorath understood. With the slow, cold understanding of a man watching a door close from the wrong side, that his wife had not left him in a moment of weakness. She had left him in a moment of architecture. The architecture had been built over years. He had simply not been invited to see the blueprints. Meanwhile, at the cottage on the cliff, Inessa was kneading dough. She had not made bread in 9 years. Caspian had not liked the smell of yeast in the house. He had said it was peasant food. She had agreed at the time, the way she had agreed to so many things, and then quietly stopped baking. Now she stood at the kitchen counter with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and flour on her wrists, and her grandmother's old wooden bowl in front of her, and she kneaded the dough for 40 minutes with the calm satisfaction of a woman returning to a language she had not spoken aloud in a long time. The dough rose. She baked it. The cottage filled with the smell of warm bread and salt wind, and Inessa Marcassin, which was once again her legal name on every document that mattered, sat at the kitchen table with a slice of bread and a cup of tea, and a notebook open to a fresh blank page. She wrote 1 line at the top of the page. "What I want to do next." She left the rest of the page empty. She had time now. She had nothing but time. In the days that followed, the world rearranged itself with a speed that surprised everyone except Thea Brossard. The freeze on the commercial accounts held. Caspian's organization, which had run for 24 years on the assumption that money moved when he said it moved, discovered that money did not move when a magistrate's signature said otherwise. 2 of his oldest associates began, very quietly, to take meetings without him. The man in Lyon who had not received his wire stopped returning Caspian's calls. Anouk Verrier, who had been waiting at the apartment on Rue de la Paix with a suitcase of her own and a dress she had bought for the occasion, learned within 4 days that the man she had agreed to leave her own life for was not, after all, the man she had been promised. He was not free. He was, in fact, in the middle of the most expensive and most public legal collapse of his adult life. She left the apartment on the 5th day. She did not leave a note. She left only a key on the table by the door. Caspian arrived at the apartment that evening to find it empty. He sat on the couch in his coat and stared at the key for an hour. Then he stood up, walked to the window and looked out over Rue de la Paix at the small café across the street, where he had once, 9 years ago, sat with Inessa Marcassin on a first date and decided that he was going to marry her. He did not cry. He had not cried since he was 7 years old in a kitchen outside Marseille, but he stood at the window for a long time. And in the village 2 kilometers from the cottage, Halia Onstad opened her shop on a Tuesday morning to find Inessa Marcassin standing on the doorstep with a loaf of bread wrapped in a clean tea towel and a small bouquet of rosemary from the hedge. "For your bees," Inessa said. "The bread is for you." Halia took the bread. She looked at Inessa for a long moment. "You look different," she said. "I feel different. You look like a woman who has remembered her own name." "I have," Inessa said. "I have remembered all of it." 6 months later, on a Tuesday in May, the small blue door of the cottage stood open to the morning sun, and Inessa Marcassin was on her knees in the garden planting tomatoes. She wore an old linen shirt that had belonged to her grandmother and a pair of canvas trousers she had bought at the village market. Her sand-colored hair was braided into the same 3 even strands her grandmother had taught her at 7, finished now with a thin green ribbon she had chosen herself that morning. There was dirt on her hands and sun on the back of her neck, and a kettle on the stove inside the kitchen, whistling softly through the open window. The cottage was no longer just a cottage. In the small barn behind it, which Inessa had restored over the winter with the help of 2 sisters from the village, there was now a 1-room studio with a long oak table, 6 chairs, a wall of bookshelves, and a printing press that had once belonged to a poet in Bordeaux, who had died with no heirs. 3 afternoons a week, Inessa taught a small group of women to read contracts, to trace assets, and to disappear without leaving a trail. She charged nothing. The classes were funded by a small foundation she had established with a portion of the restitution settlement, a foundation she had named for her mother. The first 6 women had come to her by referral. The next 16 had come on their own. There was now a waiting list. Thea Brossard came down from the city on the first weekend of every month. She brought wine and case files and her own notebook, and she and Inessa would sit in the kitchen by the copper kettle and talk for hours about women who needed reaching in time. Halia Onstad came every Thursday with honey from her bees. The small black car Inessa had bought 11 months before her marriage ended was now parked at the end of the lane with the windows rolled down most days, because the air at the cliff edge was clean. That morning in May, as Inessa knelt in the garden with her hands in the warm earth, a dark sedan slowed at the top of the stone lane. It did not come down. It stopped at the gate, perhaps 30 meters from the cottage, and the driver cut the engine. From the garden, Inessa could see the shape of a man in the driver's seat. She could not see his face through the morning glare on the windshield, but she did not need to. She knew the shape of him. She had known the shape of him for 9 years. She did not stand up. She did not stop planting. She placed another tomato seedling carefully into the soil, pressed the earth around its roots with her thumbs, and reached for the small watering can beside her. Caspian Vorath sat in the car for a long time. He had aged in the 6 months since she had last seen him. The legal collapse had cost him 3 of his largest contracts, 2 of his oldest associates, and what he privately understood to be the last of his father's reputation. He had not been ruined. Men like Caspian were never ruined, but he had been reduced. The way a room is reduced when the largest piece of furniture is finally removed and the dimensions become honest. He had come to the cottage for no reason he could fully name. He had not brought flowers. He had not brought a letter. He had simply driven, the way a man drives when he has finally understood something he should have understood a very long time ago, and he had stopped at the gate because to drive any further would have been a kind of violation he was no longer willing to commit. Through the windshield, he watched her in the garden. He watched her hands move in the dirt, sure and unhurried, the hands of a woman who knew where she was. He watched her stand. Finally, walk to the stone bench beside the small blue door, lift the basket of strawberries onto her hip, and pause with her face turned toward the sea. She was smiling. It was a small smile. It was not for him. It was not for anyone. It was the smile of a woman alone in her own garden, on her own land, in her own morning, with a basket of fruit she had grown with her own hands. Caspian Vorath understood finally what his mother had understood 40 years ago in a kitchen outside Marseille. Some women do not leave because their hearts are broken. Some women leave because their hearts are finally whole, and a fortress is no place for a whole heart. He sat in the car for one more minute. He placed his hand once, very lightly, on the steering wheel. He did not get out. He did not call her name. He understood that his presence here would be the last gift he could refuse to give her. He started the engine. He turned the car around at the top of the stone lane. He drove back toward the city, into the long, bright morning, and he did not look back, because looking back was for men who still believed they had something to return to, and Caspian Vorath no longer did. Inessa, in the garden, did not turn to watch him go. She had heard the engine. She had known, for perhaps 30 seconds, that he had been at the gate. She walked into the cottage with the basket of strawberries on her hip. She set the basket on the kitchen table. She lifted the kettle from the stove, poured a cup of tea, and carried it back outside to the stone bench, where the sun was warm now, and the rosemary was beginning to flower. The sea breathed below the cliffs. The bees moved in the rosemary. Somewhere inside the cottage, a small blue door stood open to the morning, and a key waited faithfully in its lock, the way keys do when the door belongs, finally and entirely, to the woman who turned it. She drank her tea. She closed her eyes. She had moved on. She had moved on 24 hours after he left her, and she would move on every morning for the rest of her life, because moving on, she had learned, was not a single act. It was a place a woman built for herself. And she was already home.